My son called me a loser in front of everyone. The word fell across the dinner table like a blade, sharp and deliberate. It didn't come from a stranger or a drunk in a bar. It came from the same mouth I once kissed goodnight, the same voice that used to whisper, "Mom, don't leave the light off. I'm scared of monsters." If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it has reached. The restaurant was one of those places that smelled of money, white tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, waiters who floated instead of walking. My ex-husband Mark had chosen it, of course. It was his favorite stage for showing off the life he built after leaving me. He sat across the table, his tie gleaming, his hand resting over his new gold watch. On his right was Emma, my son's glamorous wife, smiling the kind of smile that hides a knife behind it. And next to her sat my son, Daniel. My boy. He looked perfect. The tailored navy suit, the Rolex, the confident posture of a man who believed he owned the world. He swirled the wine in his glass like he'd seen Mark do 1,000 times. They were the same now, two men obsessed with the surface of things. "I just closed another round of funding," Daniel said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Investors can't wait to get in. I'm thinking of upgrading the car again. The 7 Series feels old already." Emma laughed, touching his arm lightly. "You deserve it, honey. You've worked so hard." Mark nodded, his tone dripping with condescension. "Ambition, Daniel. That's what separates the winners from the rest. Your mother, she's a kind woman, but she never understood that." The air tightened. My fingers froze around the fork. Daniel smirked. "Exactly. That's why she spent her life building for other people instead of herself." "Sorry, Mom, but it's true. You're, well, a loser." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sound of a spoon clinking against a glass somewhere in the room was the only thing alive. Emma lowered her gaze, pretending to be embarrassed. But I saw satisfaction flicker in her eyes. Mark simply smiled, pleased that his lesson had taken root. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just placed my napkin on the table, folded it neatly, and stood up. My knees didn't shake. My voice didn't tremble because there was nothing left to say. I walked out of that restaurant alone, past the chandeliers, past the whispers. Outside, the air was cool and clean. I didn't call for a cab. I walked home through the quiet Atlanta streets, the heels of my shoes echoing against the pavement, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. That night, in the silence of my house, I finally understood. Monsters don't always hide under the bed. Sometimes, they sit across from you, wearing your last name and calling you Mom. To one that. And that was the night I decided I would take everything back. I have spent my whole life building things that last. Bridges, roads, foundations, strong enough to hold the weight of other people's dreams. I was the only female civil engineer in my company back in the 70s. And I learned early that real strength doesn't shout, it endures. Maybe that's why Daniel mistook my quiet for weakness. He never saw the calculations behind my calm or the steel beneath my silence. When his father, Mark, left me 15 years ago, I didn't fight for sympathy. I fought for survival. I rebuilt my life from the ground up, brick by brick. The divorce settlement wasn't huge, but I invested every dollar wisely: rental properties, construction stocks, and a small tech venture that no one thought would make it. That venture became my seed capital for everything Daniel believed was his. He was in college when I first noticed the change. The sweet boy who used to build Lego towers beside me started speaking like a salesman, chasing applause more than purpose. He wanted success fast, loud, and shiny. So I gave him the illusion of it. I let him believe he was discovered by investors, when in truth, the venture capital firm that funded his company was a shell corporation. I created Innovate Future Group, operated quietly through my attorney, Alicia Warren. It wasn't charity, it was a test. I wanted to see if my son could grow into the kind of man who built something real. But instead, he built a life on borrowed light. He started living in a world where style replaced substance, where a luxury car meant power, and a penthouse meant pride. Every holiday dinner, I'd listen to him boast about deals he never closed and investors he never met. Emma would sit beside him, nodding like a queen beside her king. I stayed silent, watching, studying the cracks forming beneath their marble facade, because I knew something he didn't. Every empire that rises on sand must one day meet the tide. On the night he called me a loser, I didn't just lose a son. I lost the last thread of hope that he would ever see me as more than his safety net. And so, as I walked home that night, I made a decision. If he needed to fall to learn how to stand, then I would no longer stop his fall. What Daniel didn't know was that his life, the company, the car, the penthouse, wasn't his creation. It was mine. And that night, I decided to start dismantling it, piece by piece. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was silent, except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. I brewed my coffee the way I always did, black, no sugar, and watched the first light pour through the window like a quiet promise. My hands didn't tremble. I had been preparing for this day for years. I went into my study, a small room lined with blueprints and framed photographs of bridges I had designed. On the desk sat my old Dell computer, its screen faintly glowing in the dark. I turned it on and opened a folder marked SP. Inside it was everything: documents, contracts, legal frameworks that tied together the invisible web of companies under my name. At the center of it all was one phrase: Sunset Protocol. That's what my lawyer, Alicia Warren, and I had called it. A plan not for revenge, but for correction. The sunset was never about ending something. It was about bringing light to the truth before darkness took over completely. I opened my email and typed a short message. Subject: Initiate Sunset Protocol. Alicia, meet me tomorrow morning at your office, 8 a.m. Begin full review and dissolution of assets related to Daniel Collins and associated entities. I hit send. The quiet whoosh of the email leaving my outbox felt like the first stone of a bridge being laid. The bridge that would lead me back to peace. That evening, I walked through my garden, pruning the rose bushes that had overgrown during the summer. Gardening, like engineering, is about control, cutting what's dying so that life can return stronger. As I trimmed the withered stems, I thought about Daniel. I remembered him as a boy, running through this same yard, his hands stained with dirt and laughter. Somewhere between those small hands and the man who called me a loser, he lost his roots. Inside, I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat by the window. The city lights of Atlanta blinked in the distance, silent witnesses to my resolve. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was a luxury of the powerless. What I felt now was colder, clearer, a sense of design, of necessary structure. Tomorrow, the the first phase would begin. By Monday morning, Daniel's world would start to shift. And for the first time in my life, I wouldn't be the one holding it together. Alicia Warren's office sat high above Peachtree Street, all glass and sunlight. She had been my attorney, confidant, and at times, the only person who truly understood the difference between vengeance and justice. When I walked in that morning, she didn't need to ask why I was there. She simply nodded toward the leather chair across from her desk and said softly, "It's time, isn't it?" I handed her a file folder, thick with signatures and sealed documents. "Everything we built to protect him," I said. "Now, we dismantle it. Everything." She put on her glasses and began scanning the papers. AC Tech Solutions, 60% ownership through Innovate Future Group, registered in Delaware. Collins Holdings owns the BMW lease. Oak Ridge Properties owns the penthouse lease under executive status. And Mark. She paused, smirking. Still getting 50 grand a month in consulting fees from Daniel's company. All through your trust. I leaned back in my chair. He called me a loser, Alicia. She looked up, her eyes soft. Then let's remind them who built their ladder. We began planning every detail. Each thread of the tapestry I'd woven to hold them up would now be pulled, quietly, precisely. Alicia called it controlled demolition. The finally fought Monday morning. Revoke the vehicle lease under Collins Holdings, she said, typing rapidly. Tuesday. Freeze AC Tech corporate cards and accounts. Wednesday. Terminate the penthouse lease under the employment clause. They'll feel the ground shifting before they even understand why. I nodded. There was no satisfaction in it. Only a strange calm, like watching a bridge collapse that you knew could no longer hold its weight. Before leaving, Alicia stopped me at the door. You're sure about this, Margaret? Once this starts, there's no going back. I smiled faintly. There's no back to go to. That evening, I returned home and sat at my kitchen table with my old notebook, the one Daniel had scribbled drawings in as a boy. On the first page, I had once written, "Build with purpose, or the structure won't stand." Somewhere along the way, he forgot that lesson. I closed the notebook and whispered to the empty room. It's time you learn what real foundations feel like, my son. The next morning, as sunlight touched the horizon, I imagined the first tow truck rolling into the garage beneath Daniel's penthouse. By nightfall, his empire would take its first crack. Monday morning arrived bright and ordinary, the kind of morning that makes you forget how quickly lives can change. I drank my coffee slowly, tasting nothing but resolve. I didn't watch the news. I didn't pace. I sat on the back porch and listened to the neighborhood wake up a dog barking 2 houses down. The distant hum of a delivery truck, small, ordinary sounds that had nothing to do with the storm I had started. Around 9, my phone buzzed. No missed calls. No frantic texts from Daniel yet. That calm felt deliberate, like the quiet right before a thunderclap. I kept my eyes on the roses until the first message came through a short, clipped email from Alicia. Vehicle repossessed. Photos attached. I didn't open them for a long minute. I folded my hands in my lap and breathed, steady as a metronome. Later that morning, screenshots found their way to social feeds. The image was ridiculous. A black BMW being winched out of a gleaming underground garage while suited security guards and neighbors gaped. The license plate, the logo, the polished chrome, all symbols of the life Daniel had flashed around like a badge. There was no poetic justice in the picture, only the sterile mechanics of a tow truck doing the job it had been paid to do. By noon, a flurry of calls began. Mark called, and I let it go to voicemail. He left a message, the edges of his voice frayed by panic. "Margaret, this is a mistake. You know I never wanted." He trailed off into pleas. I didn't reply. Let them feel the first inconvenience, the jolt of being forced to improvise, to ride an Uber across town, to sit in traffic and think. Daniel texted me later that afternoon. I read his words twice before replying once. "Where is my car?" he wrote. Then a second message. "This is ridiculous, Mom. Fix it." I typed 3 words and hit send. You lost it. Not gloating, not triumphant, just factual. In my chest, there was a hollow ache where worry used to live. This was the point where my role shifted from protector to teacher, and that change was heavier than any anger. He tried everything. Calls to leasing companies, frantic emails to Alicia's firm, angry voicemails left for executives who, up until now, had only admired his charm. The world he had taken for granted responded with bureaucracy and documentation. Contracts read, clauses enforced, signatures checked. It was legal. It was one more professional thing he had never learned to navigate himself because someone else had always done it for him. That evening, a neighbor posted a short clip of Daniel standing on the curb, suit wrinkled, phone clenched to his ear, watching the tow truck pull his status away. He looked small in that frame, not because of his clothes, but because of how exposed he suddenly was. Pride is loud until the moment it isn't. I sat in my kitchen and watched the sun sink behind the oaks. The garden smelled like cut grass, and something softer, the kind of quiet that comes after an honest rain. There was no celebration. There was no malice. Just the steady work of someone who had spent a lifetime building things that last, now taking apart a lie with the same patient hands. Tomorrow would bring another lesson. Tuesday morning, the city was washed in sunlight, but in Daniel's world, clouds were already gathering. I imagined him walking into the glass tower downtown, trying to look composed, pretending the chaos of yesterday was a fluke. I'd known that look since he was 12. The face he wore after lying about a broken window, convinced charm could fix what discipline refused to teach. While he played the part of the confident CEO, Alicia's email arrived in my inbox. Phase 2, complete. Corporate accounts, frozen as of 9 a.m. I read the words, then closed my laptop without a hint of satisfaction. The process had begun long before these actions. Years of uncorrected arrogance and blind entitlement had led him here. Today was merely the moment the structure buckled under its own weight. Around mid-morning, I received a call from an unknown number. I didn't need to check the ID. Daniel's voice came through sharp, brittle, coated with desperation. "Mom, something's wrong with the bank. None of my cards work, not the company ones. Not even the personal account. Payroll's frozen. Vendors are calling." I said nothing for a few seconds, letting the silence stretch between us. Then, in the calmest tone I could manage, I said, "Maybe it's time to focus on the work, not the image." He scoffed, muttered something about investors and emergencies, and hung up. I could picture it all. Him storming into his office, employees glancing up with a mix of pity and fear. His attempt to swipe the corporate card at the cafe downstairs, only to hear the machine beep and the barista whisper, "Declined." That's how lessons begin, not with speeches, but with small humiliations that puncture delusion. By noon, the freeze rippled outward. Mark called next, his voice cracking with panic. His so-called consulting empire, built entirely on Daniel's payments, had collapsed in a single morning. "Margaret, This is serious, he pleaded. You can't do this to us. Us. That word had always carried the weight of assumption that I existed to fix, to finance, to forgive. Not anymore. You built your house on sand, Mark, I said quietly. Don't call the ocean unfair when the tide comes in. Then I ended the call. The afternoon passed in peaceful routine. I watered my garden, paid the electric bill, and read a chapter from a book about bridge failures. How engineers learn more from collapse than from success. That evening, as twilight painted the porch in soft gold, I thought of my son sitting behind his glass desk, staring at screens that no longer responded, realizing maybe for the first time that money, power, and identity were all borrowed. Tomorrow, the final lesson would come, the one that would strip away everything and leave him standing face to face with himself. By Wednesday morning, Daniel's world was already crumbling. He just didn't know the floor beneath him was gone. He left his apartment late, wearing the same wrinkled suit he'd worn for days, his face drawn from sleeplessness. Pride made him believe things would somehow fix themselves. Pride always does. At exactly 9 a.m., Alicia called. Phase 3 executed, she said. Notice delivered. 72 hours to vacate. Her tone was steady, almost detached. I thanked her quietly and hung up. Outside, the morning sun filtered through the blinds, bright and merciless. Across the city, Daniel was walking into the storm. His wife, Brittany, was already in tears, pacing the marble floor of the penthouse. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Friends, acquaintances, people from their perfect circle suddenly curious about their downfall. When Daniel stepped inside, she turned on him, eyes wild. My cards were declined, she shouted. All of them. The salon. The store. Do you know how humiliating that was? He tried to calm her, but she was beyond reason. It's just a system glitch, he lied, his voice cracking under its own weakness. But before he could finish, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. 3 times. Firm. Final. A man in a gray suit stood at the door, a leather folder in hand. Mr. Collins? He asked. I'm Harrison, senior property manager for Oak Ridge Towers. I'm here to serve you this. He handed Daniel a thick envelope. Inside was an official notice. Lease termination. Immediate cause. The language was cold, legal, and absolute. Daniel skimmed the paper, not understanding half the words until one line stopped him cold. Employment status change renders lease void. I haven't been fired, Daniel protested. It's just temporary. I'm afraid the ownership doesn't see it that way, Harrison replied, his expression impassive. You have 72 hours to vacate. Brittany let out a sound half sob, half scream. 72 hours? We can't just leave. This is our home. The man gave a polite nod. Then I suggest you start packing. He left as quietly as he came, closing the door with a soft click that sounded more final than any slam. When the silence settled, Brittany turned on Daniel. This is your fault, she hissed. You and your stupid pride. You ruined everything. Eddie did not. Daniel stood motionless, the papers trembling in his hand. His voice came out barely above a whisper. No, he said. It was never really ours, was it? That night, as the rain began to fall over Atlanta, I sat by my window, watching lightning flicker over the skyline. For years, I had been the unseen force holding his world together. Now, I was the quiet architect dismantling it piece by piece, illusion by illusion, until only truth remained. Daniel sat across from me in the dim light of my study. His posture slumped, his confidence gone. The rain, tapping against the window, filled the silence between us. For the first time in years, I saw my son not as the man he pretended to be, but as the frightened boy I once held when thunder scared him. His eyes darted between me and the laptop screen, scanning the documents that detailed every company, every account, every property he thought he owned. So you're saying all of it, the company, the car, the penthouse, it was you? He asked, voice trembling. Yes, I said. Every piece of your success was built on a foundation I poured. You only decorated the walls. He swallowed hard, the weight of truth sinking in. Then why let me live that lie? Why not just tell me? 2. Because I wanted you to grow into the kind of man who could hold what he was given, I said softly. But you never did. You learned how to spend, not how to earn. You chased image, not integrity. He flinched. You could have helped me, Mom. You didn't have to destroy me. 7. I didn't destroy you, Daniel. I just removed the scaffolding that kept you standing. What's left is yours to build or to crumble. He looked down, tears welling but refusing to fall. For a moment, he seemed smaller, fragile, real. I thought you wanted me to succeed, he whispered. I did, I said. But success built on deceit and dependence isn't success. It's decoration on sand. I turned the screen toward him again, showing the trust documents my name on every line that mattered. You were never meant to live like this. I gave you everything, but I forgot to give you struggle. And without struggle, there's no spine. He leaned back, defeated. So what do I do now? You start over, I said. You find work that humbles you. You pay rent on a place you can afford. You learn what it feels like to stand on your own 2 feet. He looked up, eyes red, voice cracking. Do you still love me? I smiled faintly. Of course. That's why I did this. Because love isn't giving someone everything. It's teaching them to live without you. He didn't speak again. He just nodded, then stood and walked toward the door. I watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading into the night. When the door closed, I turned off the lamp. The study fell into soft darkness. It was over, not the love, not the bond, but the illusion. For the first time in years, both of us had something real to begin with. The days that followed were wrapped in a silence unlike any I had known before. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence that comes when noise has finally run its course. I no longer waited for Daniel's calls. I no longer anticipated the next crisis that would pull me back into his chaos. The air in my home felt cleaner, as if it had been purged of years of invisible dust. Each morning, I rose early and walked through my garden. The roses were blooming again, not perfectly, but enough. I trimmed the overgrown stems, feeling the weight of each careful cut. Gardening, I realized, was an act of faith. You prune what's diseased so something stronger can grow. Perhaps I had done the same with my son. On Friday, my phone finally rang. The name flashing across the screen made me pause. Brenda. I hadn't heard from her in months. My first instinct was to ignore it. But curiosity got the better of me. I answered. Margaret, she began, her voice shaking. You have to help us. Everything's gone wrong. The contract, The cars, the house, it's all collapsing. I said nothing. I listened as panic poured through the line. Mark's business was tied to Daniel's company. They froze the accounts. The bank is foreclosing on the lake house. My membership's been suspended, they said. Payments bounced. Her voice broke into a sob. You have to fix this. You can't just walk away. I took a deep breath and said, Brenda, for years, I tried to save everyone, you, Mark, Daniel, from the consequences of your own choices. But saving people who refuse to learn isn't love. It's slow destruction. Her tone turned desperate, angry. You're doing this out of spite. You want revenge. No, I replied calmly. I want peace. I want peace. I want peace. I want peace. She fell silent, the kind of silence that tells you the truth has finally landed, even if it hurts. Then she whispered, I have nothing. I looked out the window at the roses swaying gently in the wind. Then maybe now, I said, you'll start growing something real. I hung up. The world outside was quiet. The sun dipped low over the yard, bathing everything in gold. For the first time in decades, I felt light not from triumph, but from release. I had not destroyed their world. I had simply stopped holding it up. And as the evening breeze brushed against my face, I whispered to the quiet air, sometimes the hardest kind of love is letting go. A week later, the air around the house felt different, lighter, cleaner, like the calm that follows a storm. I woke up early, made tea instead of coffee, and sat by the window watching the sun rise over the oak trees. For the first time in many years, I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring. I wasn't worried about bills that weren't mine or apologies that would never come. The world was still, and I was finally part of that stillness. I didn't know where Daniel was living now. I hadn't asked, and he hadn't called. A mother's instinct would normally ache at that silence, but this time, I chose to trust it. Growth doesn't happen under supervision. It happens in solitude. Somewhere, I hoped, he was working, maybe driving deliveries, maybe managing something small but honest. I imagined him standing in line at a grocery store, paying with his own card, feeling a sense of quiet pride. As the days passed, I spent more time outdoors. The garden that once symbolized routine now felt like reflection. Each rosebush I trimmed was a reminder. Love, if not tended with boundaries, will overgrow and choke everything around it. I had spent years mistaking sacrifice for strength, believing that a mother's worth was measured by how much she could give up for others. But giving endlessly doesn't make you selfless, it makes you disappear. I had learned too late, perhaps, that protecting someone from consequences is the cruelest kindness. Daniel never learned humility, because I never required it of him, and by rescuing him every time, I taught him to drown. Now, the silence between us was not punishment. It was space sacred, necessary space where he could begin again. One evening, as the sky turned to gold, I saw a young couple walking past my gate, hand in hand, their laughter echoing down the street. I smiled faintly, remembering how Daniel once walked that way, too full of dreams, untarnished by ego. I whispered into the quiet, "May you find your way back, my son. Not to me, but to yourself." I sat down with my old engineering notebook, its pages yellowed, but still lined with neat calculations. On the first page, I added one final note, written not for a structure of steel or stone, but for the fragile architecture of love, build with purpose. Strength means knowing what to carry and what to let go. Every foundation must bear its own weight, even the ones we build for those we love. As dusk settled, I closed the notebook and placed it gently on the desk. The house around me was quiet, but it was no longer lonely. The truth was simple. I hadn't destroyed my son's world. I had cleared the debris so he could finally build his own. And as the last light faded from the sky, I realized something I wish every parent could understand, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to stop saving them.